Seth Jones, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, starkly observes that Russia's current military strategy has led to historical numbers of casualties unprecedented since World War II. This raises a critical question tonight. How did the nation once feared as the world's second strongest military descend into such a state of disarray and devastation? When it began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was indeed feared throughout the world as the second strongest army on Earth, behind only the United States in terms of sheer military might. It was supposed to be an unstoppable force, a ruthless and brutally efficient machine, overwhelming and obliterating any opposition in its path. But in Ukraine, Russia's reputation has fallen to pieces. Its allegedly all-powerful military has not only failed to achieve its objectives, but has suffered unimaginable losses. Even its most elite units have been annihilated, leaving the Kremlin's humiliated commanders relying on poorly trained, underprepared, and utterly unmotivated troops just to maintain some semblance of frontline control. This is how far the so-called second strongest military has fallen. Over the course of its war with Ukraine, it has suffered unprecedented losses on a scale not seen since the Second World War. While estimates vary from source to source, most agree that around 1.3 million Russian soldiers have been either killed or wounded. This staggering casualty figure, if accurate, represents a scale of attrition rarely seen in modern warfare, far exceeding typical projections for even prolonged, high-intensity conflicts. It suggests a fundamental miscalculation of operational risk and a disregard for human cost that deviates sharply from contemporary military doctrine. No army can handle those kinds of losses, not even the Russian army. Despite a massive population in excess of 143 million people, along with surprisingly effective recruitment campaigns that have allowed the Kremlin to add tens of thousands of new soldiers to its ranks each month quite consistently, the casualties have taken a major toll on the military's strength and its structure, as hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been either sent home in caskets or suffered terrible, life-altering injuries that made them unfit to fight. Russia's commanders have regularly had to reconstitute their units. Some brigades have actually had to be restructured several times. And, as the casualty count increased, Russia started to realize it didn't have enough infantry to keep its frontline operations up and running. So, it resorted to drastic measures, embedding elite troops into its motor rifle units. All of a sudden, some of the best trained and most skilled soldiers in the entire Russian military were showing up in frontline assaults. That includes Russian airborne forces, known as VDV paratroopers, special purpose soldiers, or Specnaz, and Russian Marines, also called Naval Infantry. These elite troops are typically reserved for special missions that are suited to their unique skill sets. They're not used to being treated like cannon fodder and thrown into frontline assaults without proper equipment and armor to back them up. As a result, even with all their training and experience, all three of these special units have since been decimated. The VDV, for example, has for many years been regarded as one of the finest paratrooper forces on the planet. Its soldiers often feature front and center in Russia's military marketing, propaganda videos, and recruitment campaigns, and before the war in Ukraine, they had amassed a stellar track record of success. Whether they were operating in Chechnya, Georgia, or Syria, these fearsome paratroopers always got the job done. Typically deployed in advanced positions or behind enemy lines to carry out surprise attacks, capture strategic assets, and disrupt enemy supply lines, paving the way for larger forces to follow up behind. That's exactly what happened during the Second Battle of Grozny, for example, or the capture of South Ossetia. It was only logical, therefore, that Russia attempted to use the VDV in a similar fashion during the early stages of its war with Ukraine. Indeed, in the opening days of the conflict, reports emerged of Russian paratroopers being deployed to the Hostomel airport in Kyiv. Presumably, their mission was to take control of the airport, limiting Ukraine's ability to counteract the Kremlin's invasion in the air. Unfortunately for them, this mission didn't quite go to plan, and actually became a major morale-boosting turning point for the Ukrainians, not the Russians. Because Ukraine had anticipated that the Kremlin's paratroopers would target Hostomel, which is situated less than 10 kilometers or 6 miles away from the capital city of Kyiv. So, when the paratroopers landed, Ukrainian troops were waiting for them. Ambushed and surrounded on all sides, the VDV lost hundreds of personnel in a matter of days. And that wasn't their only loss. Reports have also confirmed major VDV casualties in other big battles for contested regions, towns, and cities, such as Zaporizhia, Avdiivka, and Pokrovsk. We can't know exactly how many Russian paratroopers have been killed in Ukraine, and different sources give different estimates, but it's certainly a significant amount. In 2023, for example, British Defense Intelligence cited an official address by the Russian Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, who stated that 8,500 paratroopers had been wounded, and around 50% of Russia's 30,000 airborne troops had either been killed or injured in the conflict. This admission from a high-ranking Russian official is highly unusual, as military establishments typically downplay or conceal such extensive losses. The public acknowledgement of 50% casualties within an elite force like the VDV signals a level of internal strain and strategic failure that is rarely disclosed, even implicitly, during wartime. That was 2023. Since then, countless more Russians have lost their lives or suffered serious injuries in Ukraine, including VDV forces. And it's a similar story for the Specnaz. These Spec Ops soldiers are famous around the world, ranked among the most formidable forces on Earth. They have a rich pedigree of clandestine operations, direct action, hostage rescue situations, sabotage, and reconnaissance missions. At the same time, the Specnaz don't exactly have a flawless record. They have been involved in several quite spectacular failures over the years, like the infamous 2002 Moscow theater siege, which involved Chechen terrorists taking over 900 hostages at the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow. A 57-hour standoff came to an end when Specnaz forces pumped some sort of sleeping gas into the theater's ventilation system, knocking out both terrorists and hostages alike. 40 unconscious or otherwise incapacitated terrorists were executed, but over 130 hostages also died, largely as a result of the gas. This came just 6 years after another botched hostage crisis in 1996, which also involved Chechen militants initially taking several thousand people hostage. Specnaz and federal forces eventually moved in with artillery units and helicopter gunships to bombard the site of the incident, with at least 26 hostages dying in the subsequent firefight, which also wiped out an entire village. In short, despite their fearsome reputation, the Specnaz have often been associated with disorganization and recklessness. Thrown into an already disorganized war in Ukraine, they stood little chance of survival. According to the 2023 Pentagon leaks, around 900 Specnaz operators were initially deployed to Ukraine. 775 were killed or wounded. Since then, more of these special operations soldiers have presumably been sent to die on the front lines of Ukraine, with Media Zona reporting in 2025 that at least 1,000 have perished. The Russian Marines, too, have struggled to make any meaningful mark on the war with Ukraine, suffering enormous losses in numerous encounters over the years. Again, this is one of Russia's top-tier forces. The Marines, or Naval Infantry as they're known in Moscow, have led the way in various coastal assaults throughout history. They gained valuable experience in Syria, for example, with units like the 40th, 61st, 155th, and 810th, earning almost legendary status among their peers. Early into the war, it was expected that these units would be decisive on the southern front, where Russia was attempting to push into Ukraine from the Sea of Azov and the Crimean Peninsula. For a brief time, they lived up to those expectations. They suffered some losses but played their part in important amphibious assaults that helped Russia's war machine encircle the city of Mariupol and, eventually, take control of it. But the more time passed, the worse the situation became for the Marines. In the Donbass and southern regions, for instance, they started to suffer heavy casualties, which led to those once iconic brigades having to be reconstituted. The 810th, for example, has had to be restructured on several occasions after suffering losses in Mariupol, Kherson, Kursk, and Zaporizhia. The 155th suffered a similar fate, with some estimates suggesting it has undergone no fewer than 8 separate restructures, making it one of the most battered and bruised brigades of the entire war, a veritable shadow of its former self. Media Zona, which has proven to be quite an accurate and reliable source for tracking and confirming Russian casualties through official obituaries, states that over 2,200 naval infantry were killed in the first 4 years of the war. To put that into context, it's worth noting that the U.S. lost around 2,400 soldiers over the course of 20 years during its war in Afghanistan. Russia's elite troop losses are enormous, and they have had enormous effects on the country's campaign. Because losing elite troops is much more impactful than losing new recruits. These Special Forces soldiers bring years of experience to the battlefield. In most cases, they have dedicated their entire lives to the military and are among the most willing to lay their bodies on the line for their homeland. They will go the extra mile, running headfirst into the fiercest battles, leading the charge, and lighting the way for those that follow behind. But Russia is very rapidly running out of them. In fact, there are almost none left. Any military in the world would struggle after losing so many of its finest operatives, and Russia is no different. When frontline troops are killed or wounded in suicidal assaults, the Kremlin's commanders don't necessarily care all that much. They can easily just recruit more men to replace them, running them through the most basic of training programs before sticking rifles in their hands and sending them off on another attack. But the likes of VDV, Naval Infantry, and Specnaz are nowhere near as easy to replace. And even if the Kremlin can find people with the right aptitudes and skill sets, it doesn't have the time to train its next generation of Spec Ops soldiers correctly. As noted in a Small Wars Journal report, it's likely that new Russian specialized troops will be subject to the same rushed training as the rest of the armed forces, which could lead to further wartime losses of critical operators that the Kremlin cannot afford to lose. That's not all. After suffering such heavy losses, the 3 elite forces have started to break ranks. They're no longer quite as structured or disciplined as they once were, with both the 155th and 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigades having been accused of war crimes. Reportedly, these Marines have used banned chemical substances and brutally executed Ukrainian prisoners of war. Paratroopers are also implicated, with some allegedly involved in the infamous Bucha massacre of 2022, which saw civilians quite literally slaughtered in the streets. In addition, due to old-fashioned Soviet doctrines that focus on micromanagement at even the highest levels of the military, elite unit commanders don't have the authority or freedom they need to make the most of the troops they have left. This creates a culture of distrust, which, when combined with such heavy casualties, is only going to hinder Russia's progress on the battlefield. And with such a large number of losses to contend with, it's possible that Russia may be reduced to using regular infantry in specialized roles, despite them not having the requisite skills or experience. We might see new recruits rushed into the Specnaz brigades just to make up the numbers, for example, while VDV operators are being thrown into frontline assaults. In short, the Russian military is in a complete mess, and there's no hope of it getting any better anytime soon. Indeed, even if we look beyond the elite units, like the Naval Infantry and Specnaz, the rest of Russia's personnel are simply not up to the standard required to win this war. Increasingly, its soldiers are not just poorly trained or under-equipped, but absolutely unfit for combat in every conceivable way. There have been reports of people with terminal illnesses, or even missing limbs, being dispatched to frontline locations, for example, along with convicts and unfortunate ethnic minorities, tricked or blackmailed into joining the war. Russia has also been digging around in other countries to replenish its ranks, recruiting African mercenaries and begging North Korea to send soldiers too. As a result, statistics show that the Kremlin's army in 2026 is barely making any progress in numerous frontline locations. Its advances are embarrassingly slow, and it's even losing ground in certain areas as Ukraine's counteroffensives gain momentum. And when you look at the kinds of people the Kremlin is sending to fight, and more importantly, the kinds of commanding officers who are placed in charge of those soldiers, it's not hard to understand why. Because the more time passed in this war, the more brutal and cruel the Russian commanders have become. There are now hundreds of videos swirling across social media demonstrating the depravity of these men, who have no qualms about torturing, abusing, exploiting, and even killing the soldiers under their command. Some are locked in cages or tied to trees. Others are electrocuted or sexually assaulted. There have even been reports of pairs of soldiers being thrown into pits and forced to fight to the death. Many soldiers also suffer terrible injuries during their time on the front lines, but are made to stay and fight on, rather than being evacuated for medical treatment or discharged. Commanders also often demand their soldiers pay them daily tolls or hand over their bank cards, and those who refuse are, once more, tortured or punished in other ways, like being first in line for the next assault. There are clips of men being tied up and beaten, made to strip to their underwear in freezing conditions, or even being sent to fight with broken legs, limping into battle on crutches, with zero chance of survival unless some sympathetic Ukrainian soldier on the other side decides to spare them. The Kremlin's war machine is a hideous hive of torture, corruption, and criminality, and it's only getting worse. Leaked messages sent to a Russian government website reveal the desperation of Russian recruits and their families. Over the course of a single 6-month period, the website received a whopping 12,000 complaints, accusing commanders of corruption and violence towards their own men. This extraordinary volume of internal complaints paints a picture of systemic breakdown and moral decay within the Russian military, a stark contrast to the disciplined image it projects. Such widespread grievances, openly reported to government channels, suggest a level of internal dissent and abuse that severely undermines combat effectiveness and unit cohesion, far beyond typical wartime stresses. Russian researcher Alexandra Arkhipova has sifted through the swaths of messages, documenting the barbaric tactics these officers deploy, noting that many will happily resort to torture to take money from their soldiers. Arkhipova adds that large numbers of soldiers today, many of whom joined the war because they come from poor backgrounds and wanted to earn money to support their families, are pressured into giving away up to 80% of their salaries just to stay alive. Recruits are effectively given a choice: pay up or die. Commanders have even established their own price lists: $2,000 for a soldier to be assigned as a drone operator so they don't have to take part in frontline assaults, $6,000 to serve in the rear, even further from the frontline kill zones, or a jaw-dropping $12,000 if someone wants to be discharged on medical grounds. The worst part is that because the Russian economy is so bad, and regular Russian people are feeling the effects the most, able-bodied individuals will keep on signing up and receiving this kind of treatment, as Arkhipova explains. The situation in Russia, from the economical point of view, is very bad. Poor people, they became poor, so they go to the war. Taxes are going up, and it's a big problem now what to buy for dinner. And this is the price of the war. It's a miserable state of affairs for Russia's recruits, but it's also a grim sign for the country's military as a whole. With such losses, so much corruption, and such pitiful levels of morale, how can the Kremlin ever hope to even achieve any of its stated objectives, let alone win this war? For now, it seems to believe that simply throwing more and more men into the meat grinder is the only option. But, as Seth Jones from the Center for Strategic and International Studies notes, this is not a winning approach. I think this is where the Russians believe this is the least worst strategy, because they have an advantage in numbers. The problem, of course, is that it leads to historical numbers of casualties. It is unprecedented since World War II. The casualties are now so extreme that Russia is actually running out of room to bury its dead. Meanwhile, the country's desperate authorities have resorted to blurring out images of military cemeteries in a pathetic attempt to hide the harsh and ugly reality of the situation. This cannot continue. It's not sustainable. Russia knows it, and the data proves it. Indeed, in the first few months of 2026, reports revealed that the Kremlin at last began to lose more soldiers than it was able to recruit. It is doing everything in its power, short of a full-scale mobilization, to expand its manpower, from offering increasingly large and ludicrous cash incentives to fooling students with misleading recruitment videos. But it's not working, and Ukraine is getting stronger all the time, with more lethal drones, more long-range missiles, and ever-improving morale as its forces continue to dig in and defy the Russians along every axis. Soon, Kyiv's commanders hope to be inflicting up to 50,000 casualties on Russia every single month. Meanwhile, their Russian counterparts are too busy extorting and torturing their own men to even care about how the war is going. The balance of power is shifting, and Russia is on the wrong end of the equation.